Welcome to our class. In this class, we will look at how PHP works with dates and time. We will be using the term timestamp. A timestamp refers to the number of seconds since this particular date, January 1st, 1970, Greenwich Mean Time at midnight. So dates store all of the seconds that have elapsed from that date to the current date, or whichever date we are working with. The term timestamp applies to the older technology of using functions for time, and also to the newer technology of working with objects and methods. So there are two ways that PHP works with dates. And when I talk about a date, it also includes time, because it's returning the number of seconds. And if you don't specify a time in a date, it will assume midnight, which is the beginning of a day. Okay, one reason why they went to the object-oriented approach was because these functions eventually will have what is called a Y2K38 issue. So when we get to the year 2038, due to the way that they are using this 32-bit integer, it's no longer going to keep on going forward, and it's going to revert back to the 1900s. So we will have a similar issue that we had with other dates in the millennium. However, these functions do work. It is recommended that you do not use them if you are starting a new application. Instead, use the object-oriented approach. So some of the common functions that we will be using: date, time, and make time, and we'll explain them. And for the objects and their methods. One thing I would like to point out, when you're working with a method in PHP, you have the object and method. They are essentially joined with this symbol. It is a hyphen and the greater than sign. If you're familiar with other object-oriented languages where they use a dot, we do not use the dot syntax. This is the syntax that calls a method from an object. So let's take a look at the date function. Now that doesn't give us the number of seconds. It returns a string for a date that we pass to this function. And this is the general syntax. And this is not really a variable, this is just the format. And this is optional if you were to pass it a timestamp. So by default, the date function will apply to the current date if you don't specify a timestamp. So at minimum, and here we have an echo statement, if we were to process this line of code, echo with a capital D, that is the formatting character. Now over here on the right, it essentially will return the day of the week with the 3 letters. So MON for Monday. However, if you wanted the day of the week with a full name, you could pass it a lowercase l. So there are different, and these are called formatting characters, which is why they have this dollar format here. And you can build string expressions, hyphenated, slashed, and this is hours. And you can have a combination of all of them: days, minutes, seconds, hours, etc. All right, so unless we specify a particular date, we're working with the current date. So here again, the date function is going to return a string to represent the current date. Should we wish to represent another date, then we need to pass it a timestamp. And how do we get that timestamp? I'll show you. But before I show you, let's take a look at some of the different examples that we have here with the date. So here, this expression, based on the different formatting symbols, will give us this type of date. This expression will give us this type of date. We can add commas, and everything is inside a string literal here. We can add colons, the lowercase a, will return AM or PM. Here's another expression. If you want to put words inside, they must be escaped. And here's another expression. So there are a numerous number of ways that we can display a date using the date function. And remember, this would be referring to today, at the time when this slide was made. Okay, the time function. Now, this is how we get a timestamp. It's going to return the current day and time as a timestamp. So that's going to be a number. So if we wanted to format that timestamp, we would need to use the date function. Now remember, this returns the current date. Now supposing we wanted a different date, then we would use the MakeTime function. And here again, based on what we are passing it, we would pass it a string, a date string, and it's going to return a number. And we can use that number with the date function. There are some other functions. We can determine whether it's a valid date, and we can also retrieve a date by passing it a timestamp. And the parts can be parsed as an associative array. So let's look at using the time function. So if I were to execute this function and store the value in this variable $t, remember this is holding seconds. And now I use the date function to output those number of seconds in this format. I have to pass it this timestamp variable here, and that's the number of seconds. Now this would be formatting the current time. You really don't have to do that, because by default, date will format the current time. I'm just explaining it to you. However, if you wanted to format a different time, you would need to use MakeTime. And here again, we just pass it a date, and it can include time. For example, this is 8 o'clock, 7/4/2000, July 4th. And by passing it the timestamp, we would return a formatted date and time. So here's the get date. Here again, we need to use the time function in order to obtain the number of seconds in order to pass to this function. And this is where you can essentially parse out the different parts, because it returns an associative array. That's what this function does. So here, if we had a time and we're setting it in this variable called expires, and we're using the getDate function with the variable expires, which is a lot of seconds, and we're assigning that to this variable parts, we can actually use these different values of parts. Here again, parts is looked at as an associative array, and we can return different parts of that date. We can return the year, the month number, the month name, the day, etc. The string to time function. This also is another way of converting a text expression that represents a date and or time to a timestamp. So for example, if we were to pass it this date string, and because we did not pass it a time, it's returning midnight. So there are different ways that we can pass date strings. Here we can pass a time, or just 8 a.m. You can also pass it relative values. 1 plus the hour, minus 2 days, tomorrow at a certain time, next Sunday, etc. So this is actually a very nice function. So this is the preferred way to work with dates and time. It's the DateTime object. And in order to use that, you need to essentially create a new instance of this object and store it in the variable. This line of code will retrieve the current date and time, whatever that happens to be, and it will be storing it in this variable in the amount of seconds. This is still considered a timestamp. Now, example, if we wanted to use the string to time format, we could pass it a specific time and or date, and it would return the number of seconds. So by passing a value to this object, we can get another date besides the current date. And we can use the same formats as we did with the string to time function. So let's take an example of how we work with some of these methods. We have a format method, a set time method, a set date, modify, get timestamp, and set timestamp. So there are different methods that work with this date time object. The first thing you always need to do is you need to create that object. It will either be the current one or one that you specify based on passing a parameter to the object here. So here we're working with the current date and we're storing it in this variable now. And if I wanted to format it, this is the same formatting structure that we used with the date function. Here's object now, and we're accessing the method. So here's my symbol, the hyphen and the greater than symbol, and there's the format method. I'm passing it a value. Now if I wanted to also execute the get timestamp, we could do that also, because remember, now stores a timestamp, but how we would know what that is, we need to use the get timestamp method. So we are executing these methods on this object using this symbol. If I wanted to specify a date or time, I could specify it here. I can also use a setDate method of the date object. We would need to first instantiate this date object. Then I can format this. So there's several different approaches that pretty much can get you to the same place. We also have a date interval object. The date interval object allows us to get a longer period of time, not just one, but a time from one point to another. So here we need to instantiate this object again, and because we're working with an interval, we have to pass it some kind of a value. It needs to know what interval we're working with, and we would store that in this variable. There are different formats, parts of this interval string, and here some of them are specified. And what I have here, P, meaning it begins the interval code, which you always have to have, 30, which is the number 30, D, which stands for days, the number of days. So this would mean I'm storing the amount of seconds in an interval of 30 days. Now if I wanted to format this, I have the object storing the value in this variable, and I can format this. So here we have the formatting codes that date interval works with. And there are many combinations, as you can see, for formatting an interval. And what it's going to do, it's going to essentially tell you how many days or how many months, how many hours and seconds. It's not going to tell you how many weeks. There are 3 different methods that are specifically used with the date interval object. And I'm going to look at the diff method here. So supposing we have a date here, which is January 1st, 2013, and we're storing that in this variable. We have another date here, February 10th, 2013, and we're storing it here. If I wanted to find the difference between these 2 dates, there's date 1, and I'm accessing this method, the diff method, and I'm passing the parameter date 2. So now I have a value stored in this variable. So I can use the format method, and I can output a string literal with an expression %a, which is going to give me days, and this is what it would say. I can also translate it into how many months and days rather than just the total number of days. So these are some very interesting methods to help perform date calculations on the server.